Now, we have one more piece to talk about, and that is the king. So the king is the most important piece in the game. Notice I didn't say most powerful, but it is the most important because if you lose your king, you lose the game. We'll go into more detail about how either side might be able to lose their king, but for now, let's just talk about the basic moves. So, a king is pretty easy to remember. For the most part, a king just moves one square at a time in any direction he might choose. So as you can see here, we have any of these squares available. For this king, obviously you can't move off the board, but we have any of these squares. And to capture, it's pretty simple. We just move our king to somewhere where we can step onto an enemy piece and we capture it. Same as we've seen for all of the other pieces except pawns during en passant. Now, there's one more important detail to notice right here, and that is that right here, even though the black king can reach any of these squares, he's not allowed to move there. Why is that? Well, if you notice, going to any of these squares puts the black king under threat of capture, which is an illegal move in chess. The king is never allowed to be placed in a location where it might be captured. Now, this might seem strange since I just mentioned earlier that to win a game, one side must lose their king. Well, again, we'll go into that more in detail in a later part of this video series, but for now, let's move on to one of the special moves the king has called castling. Okay, so this position is a bit more complicated, but not to worry, we're just focusing on one small part of it. So, as we see here, we have the kings in the middle, and since we noticed that it's very important to not lose your king in the game, it would make sense if we had some sort of way to make sure that our king is safer and is free from any sort of threat of capture. So we have a move called castling that lets us get our king out of the center towards one of the sides where it's safer. So one of the ways to do that, you can either castle king side or castle queen side. So in this case, we see here that to castle, we always want to move our king 2 squares in one of the 2 directions we might want to castle, and then we hop the rook over our king to the other side. So again, just for a quick replay of that, we move 2 squares, and then the rook jumps over the king. And if we move in the other direction, you can see it's the same. King 2 squares, rook over. 2 squares, rook over. And it works the exact same way for black. 2 squares, rook over, or 2 squares, rook over. So that's a basic way of how you castle. There are a few rules regarding castling, though, that are important to keep in mind. So let's go look at another example. So in this case, we see that the first condition of castling is met. There are no pieces in between the king or the rook. This is important to remember. You cannot castle if there are pieces blocking the line of sight between the king and the rook. That's the number 1 rule. The second rule is that the king and the rook must both be on their starting square. So as you can see here again, this king is on the starting square and this rook is on the starting square. And the king must not have moved and the rook must not have moved from their starting square at any point in the game. So right here we can see we can castle queenside currently, but if for example, we moved our king and then we moved our king back, the king is still on his starting square. We can see on the next move, we do not have the option to castle anymore. That is because the king has left his starting square. Okay. And then the final restriction on castling to keep in mind is, remember how we said that a king cannot ever be legally put under threat of capture? As in, we cannot move our king to here, where this bishop would threaten to take our king. And in fact, the same goes for castling. If we see here, this bishop is attacking this square, and so we can't castle in this direction, because doing so would move us through the threat of check. And if we see here, the same is true for black and queenside castling. This white queen is attacking this square, and so therefore we cannot castle in this direction, because doing so would put the black king under threat of attack. Okay. And finally, a king cannot castle out of check. So if we see here, the white queen is attacking the black king, and the black king is in check. That's what check means, by the way, is when one piece attacks the enemy king. So in this case, we see here that black cannot castle to either side, even though neither king nor rook has left their starting square, and there is no check in the way. So in this case, black would either just have to move the king away or maybe block the line of sight of the queen.